Tonight, we dive into 10 chilling tales where clowns are far more than just performers. You'll never look at clowns the same way again. Story 1. The Silent Clown. Lisa had always hated clowns. Their painted faces and exaggerated grins filled her with an unexplainable dread. She couldn't even pinpoint why. Maybe it was a childhood fear, maybe something buried deep in her subconscious. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw that night. It was nearly midnight when she noticed it. A clown standing at the end of her street, perfectly still under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. It was far enough away that she couldn't make out its features clearly, but it was unmistakable. A red nose, white face, a frilly costume. And worst of all, it was staring directly at her house. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Was this some kind of prank? A lost entertainer? Halloween had passed weeks ago, so why would anyone be dressed like that now? She tried to convince herself that it was nothing. Maybe some weird neighborhood kid messing around. She pulled the curtains shut, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The next morning, she hesitated before opening the door. She didn't know what she expected, but when she finally stepped outside, her stomach twisted into knots. Tied to her doorknob was a single deflated red balloon. Lisa stared at it, heart pounding. She looked up and down the street. Empty. No sign of the clown. Had someone put it there as a joke? She ripped the balloon off and threw it in the trash, trying to brush it off. But as the sun set, she felt the unease creeping back in. She tried not to look, but she couldn't resist. Peering out her window, she gasped. The clown was back. This time it was closer. It stood directly across the street, beneath a different street lamp. Its posture was the same, unnaturally rigid, head slightly tilted, eyes locked onto her house. Lisa's fingers trembled as she gripped her phone, debating whether to call the police. But what would she even say? There's a clown standing outside? They'd laugh at her. She closed the curtains tightly, locked the doors, and went to bed, forcing herself to believe it would be gone by morning. But at exactly 3:33 a.m., she woke up to a faint, high-pitched squeaking sound. Her breath hitched. It was the sound of a balloon being twisted. She turned her head toward the closet, her body frozen in fear. The door was slightly ajar, and peeking out from the darkness was a white-painted face, its red grin stretching even wider. Story 2. The Birthday Guest. Danny's 7th birthday party was supposed to be perfect. His parents had rented a bouncy castle, hired a magician, and even brought in a clown named Jolly Jack to entertain the kids. Danny had never really liked clowns, but his mom insisted it would be fun. Jolly Jack arrived right on time. He was tall, his costume slightly baggy, his makeup smudged just enough to look off. His yellow teeth were visible beneath his exaggerated grin. As he performed tricks, pulling endless scarves from his sleeve, twisting balloon animals, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that the clown was watching him too closely. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but even when Jolly Jack was juggling or making the other kids laugh, his gaze never seemed to leave Danny. As the party started winding down, Danny's mom gathered all the kids for a group photo. That's when she noticed something strange. She counted them once, then again. There was an extra child. He wasn't one of the guests. He stood at the very edge of the group, dressed in old-fashioned, tattered clothes. His face was painted white, and his mouth stretched into an eerie, unnatural grin. His eyes were dull, almost lifeless. Danny's mom frowned. "Whose kid is this?" Silence. The other children seemed confused. No one claimed to know the boy. She turned to Jolly Jack, expecting an explanation, but the clown only chuckled and whispered, "I always bring a friend." Danny's mom yanked her son away from the group, but when she turned back, the extra child and Jolly Jack were gone. The party ended abruptly. Parents picked up their children, the decorations were taken down, and Danny's mom tried to shake the unease. Maybe she had counted wrong. Maybe the clown had just been playing a trick. That night, after Danny had gone to bed, she walked past his room and noticed something sitting on his nightstand. A small, tattered party hat. It wasn't one of Danny's. And outside, just beyond the glow of the street lamp, two figures stood in the darkness, waiting. Story 3. The Funhouse Mirror. Mark and his friends loved haunted attractions, so when the old fairground reopened for one final weekend before demolition, they couldn't resist going. The place had been abandoned for years, and urban legends claimed it was haunted. The highlight of the night was the Laughing Maze, a creepy, run-down funhouse full of distorted mirrors and eerie sound effects. As they entered, Mark's stomach twisted. The whole place smelled musty, and the flickering lights cast strange, shifting shadows on the walls. At first, it was fun. His friends laughed as they stumbled through the disorienting pathways, their reflections stretching and warping in bizarre ways. But then, something changed. Mark noticed that one of the reflections wasn't moving correctly. In the corner of his eye, a figure loomed in one of the mirrors. A tall, hunched clown with hollow eyes and a gaping, exaggerated grin. Its painted face seemed smeared, as if the colors had started melting off. Mark turned around. Nothing was there. His friends were further ahead, giggling and taking pictures, oblivious. He swallowed hard and kept walking, trying to shake the unease. But every time he passed another mirror, the clown was closer. His heart pounded. He spun around expecting something to be behind him. The hallway was empty. A whisper echoed through the maze, soft and childlike. "Why won't you play with me?" Mark bolted. He ran through the maze, pushing through curtains and mirrors until he finally saw the exit. His friends were already outside, waving at him. He burst out of the funhouse, panting. Did you guys see that clown?" They looked at him, confused. "What clown?" Mark turned back toward the entrance, his blood running cold. The mirrors inside were completely empty. The clown was gone. But later that night, as Mark was getting ready for bed, he glanced at his bathroom mirror. And there, standing right behind his reflection, was the clown. This time, it wasn't just a reflection. Story 4. The Puppet Clown. Ethan loved old, weird antiques, so when he stumbled upon a dusty wooden clown marionette at a flea market, he couldn't resist. It had a hand-painted face, glassy blue eyes, and a permanently fixed grin. The vendor warned him, "It's an old theater prop. Some folks say it moves on its own, probably just loose strings." Ethan chuckled, took it home, and placed it on a shelf in his bedroom. That night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard faint giggling. He sat up, heart pounding, and turned on the light. The room was silent. The puppet sat lifelessly on the shelf, its head tilted slightly to the side. Ethan shook his head, muttering about his overactive imagination, and went back to sleep. The next morning, something was different. The puppet had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on his desk, arms outstretched as if waiting for someone to play. Ethan frowned. Maybe it had fallen and landed that way. He put it back and went about his day. That night, the giggling returned. This time it was closer. He flipped on the light. The puppet was sitting on the floor, right next to his bed. His breath hitched. He hadn't touched it since putting it back on the shelf. Slowly, he picked it up and locked it in his closet, shoving a chair against the door for good measure. But at exactly 3:00 a.m., a loud thump came from inside the closet. Ethan's blood ran cold. He sat up, clutching the blankets. Then, ever so slowly, the closet door creaked open. The chair hadn't moved, but the puppet had. It stood just inside the door, its strings hanging loosely, and though its wooden mouth wasn't supposed to move, Ethan swore he heard it whisper, "Why did you lock me away?" Story 5. The Circus That Never Left. David was driving home late one night when he noticed something strange, a flickering glow in the distance. He squinted. It looked like a circus tent, red and yellow stripes illuminated under the pale moonlight. That didn't make sense. There hadn't been a circus in town for years. Curious, he pulled over. The closer he got, the weirder things became. The fairgrounds looked abandoned, overgrown grass, rusted rides, peeling posters advertising acts that hadn't performed in decades. But the big top was pristine. Lights twinkled around it, and from inside he heard muffled carnival music. Something about it felt wrong, but before he could turn away, a voice spoke. "You made it just in time for the final show." David spun around. A clown stood behind him, grinning, eyes gleaming in the dim light. Its costume was faded, as if it had been standing there for years. He took a step back. I was just leaving." The clown shook its head slowly. "The show must go on." The music from the tent grew louder, more distorted. Then the flap lifted. Inside, rows of empty seats filled the tent, all facing the center ring. And in that ring stood more clowns. They all turned toward him in unison, their grins stretching wider. David ran. He sprinted back to his car, heart pounding. When he finally reached it, he fumbled with the keys, throwing himself inside and slamming the door shut. He gasped for breath and looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. No circus, no tent, no clowns. Just an old abandoned lot. Had he imagined it? But when he reached home and stepped out of his car, something crunched under his foot. He looked down. A circus ticket. Stamped with the words, "Admit one, forever." Story 6. The Clown in the Cornfield. Every fall, the Holloway family set up a haunted corn maze on their farm. It was a local tradition. People came from miles around to get lost among the twisting stalks, chased by costumed actors lurking in the dark. This year, they had added something new. A clown scare actor. Jake, one of the workers, was assigned the role. He dressed in a tattered, mud-stained clown suit and wore a cracked porcelain mask. His job was simple: stand at the farthest bend in the maze, let people get close, then chase them back toward the exit. The first night went smoothly, but by the second, strange things started happening. People reported seeing two clowns in the maze. One was Jake. The other wasn't. At first, the Holloways assumed it was a prank. Maybe some teenager had snuck in dressed as a clown. But as the nights went on, more guests reported terrifying encounters. One woman said the second clown didn't move like a normal person. He just stood there, staring. Another claimed she ran from Jake, only to crash into the other clown further down the path. But when she blinked, he was gone. Then, on the final night, Jake never came back to the barn after closing. The Holloways searched the maze for hours, but he had vanished. The next morning they found his costume neatly folded at the center of the maze, but Jake himself was never seen again. The maze was torn down the next year. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights, visitors to the Holloway farm swear they see a clown standing in the empty field, smiling. Story 7. The Clown in the Storm Drain. It had rained all night, and the streets were flooded with muddy water. Sam was walking home from his friend's house when he heard a noise, a faint, wet chuckle coming from a nearby storm drain. He stopped, heart pounding. The streetlight flickered above him. Another chuckle, gurgling, drowned in water. He slowly approached the drain, peering inside. For a moment, he saw nothing but darkness and rushing water. Then, something shifted. A pale white face emerged from the shadows, its red lips stretching into a wide grin. "Need a hand?" the clown whispered, its voice bubbling with water. Sam stumbled backward, but the clown kept rising, pulling itself out of the drain one limb at a time. Its arms were too long, its fingers stretched and bony. Sam turned and ran. The chuckling followed him, from every drain he passed. By the time he made it home, panting and dripping with sweat, he slammed the door shut and checked the window. The street was empty. He sighed in relief, until he noticed something on the floor, a single wet clown glove. Story 8. The Forgotten Clown. The old theater had been closed for decades, but Sam and his friends loved breaking into abandoned places. The dust-covered seats, peeling wallpaper, and broken stage lights made it the perfect spot for urban exploring. "Let's check out backstage," Lisa suggested. They pushed through the rusted door and found themselves in a narrow hallway filled with faded costumes and shattered mirrors. At the end of the hall, a single spotlight shone on an old wooden storage box. "What's inside?" Sam asked, lifting the lid. The moment he did, a horrid stench filled the room. Mildew, grease paint, and something rotten. Inside the box was a clown suit, still stuffed with a body. The flesh had rotted away, leaving only a hollow grin beneath a cracked mask. Lisa screamed. Then the lights flickered. When they came back on, the box was empty. A raspy voice whispered from the shadows. "The show must go on." Story 9. The Smiling Visitor. Maya lived alone in a quiet apartment complex. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching her. She turned toward the bathroom mirror and nearly dropped her toothbrush. Behind her, in the reflection, stood a clown. Its face was painted white, lips stretched into a grin that seemed too wide. Its eyes were wrong, too hollow, too dark. She spun around. No one was there. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. The clown was closer, right behind her. She screamed and spun again, but the room was empty. Desperate, she grabbed a towel and covered the mirror. That night, she couldn't sleep. She swore she could hear faint laughter coming from inside the glass. By morning, she gathered the courage to check. The mirror was cracked, and scrawled across it in red grease paint was one word: smile. Story 10. The Last Ride. The Ferris wheel at Grayson's Carnival had been broken down for years, rusted and forgotten. No one was supposed to go near it, but one night, after a few drinks, Eric and his friends dared each other to climb on. Laughing, Eric hopped into one of the old carts and kicked his feet up. "Look at me," he joked. "I'm riding in style." Then the wheel started moving. His friends froze. "Who's running this thing?" Jake called out. Eric's laughter died in his throat as the wheel lifted him higher. The other carts were empty, except for one. Halfway up, a clown sat in the cart across from him. Its painted grin never wavered. Its hollow eyes gleamed under the moonlight. Eric's blood ran cold. The wheel kept turning, bringing him closer and closer to the clown. His breath quickened. He tried to yell for his friends, but his voice didn't come out. The clown tilted its head. It reached out a hand. Eric jumped. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his body. His friends rushed to him, yelling, but he ignored them. His eyes locked on the Ferris wheel. It had stopped. The clown was gone. But when he looked at his hands, his fingers were smeared with red paint. Or was it blood? And there you have it. 10 terrifying tales of clowns you'd never want to meet. Whether they're hiding in storm drains, watching from mirrors, or waiting in abandoned circus tents, one thing remains the same. They're always smiling. So next time you hear faint giggling in the dark, or see a balloon floating where it shouldn't be, ask yourself, is it just your imagination? Or is someone waiting for you to laugh? Sleep well, if you can.